One day, my daughter-in-law laughed behind my back. She said, I dress like a ghost. Old, colorless, invisible. Everyone laughed, even my son. I didn't respond. I just disappeared, moved away, left every group chat, stopped answering their calls. And while they were busy discussing how to handle me, I was signing a new agreement. The house, the accounts, the land, all transferred to other hands, and they never even realized when it happened. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Mary Louise Grayson. I was 73 years old the winter I finally understood what it meant to feel invisible. Not in the poetic sense, not as a metaphor, but in the literal aching way one disappears slowly from the center of their own life. I had once been someone, a registered nurse for 38 years, mostly in surgical recovery. I had held trembling hands and calmed patients in pain, stitched wounds and kept families from falling apart in waiting rooms. I had been called an angel by more than one person on the edge of goodbye. And yet, in my own home, I had become a ghost. After I retired, I thought I was doing the right thing. I told myself that over and over when Mark, my only child, called to say they were having a hard time with rent, that daycare for the twins was draining them, that their apartment was falling apart. It seemed natural to offer help. I had the space. A big old house with a wraparound porch, 4 bedrooms, a sunny kitchen, and a backyard that once hosted every 4th of July barbecue in the neighborhood. It didn't make sense for it to sit half empty, with just me and the cat. So they moved in. It started off with gratitude, polite thank yous, casseroles in return, offers to mow the lawn. Julie, my daughter-in-law, insisted on doing the grocery shopping to take the load off. I smiled and let it happen. I was still in the habit of saying yes. I was trained after decades of nursing to be agreeable, to keep the peace. But slowly, without fanfare, the house began to shift around me. My antique tea set was packed away to make more counter space. The living room was rearranged without asking. My sewing table was relocated to the garage so the twins could have a play area. I didn't protest. I told myself it was practical. Then my routines were rewritten. Breakfast was no longer at the table, but on the go. Dinners came later and louder. My quiet evenings with crossword puzzles and public radio were drowned out by cartoons and arguments about screen time. Julie began referring to my bedroom as Grandma's space, as though I were a tenant in my own home. The thermostat was lowered without asking. Energy costs, Mark explained, though I was the one paying the bills. My slippers never felt warm enough. I wrapped myself in shawls and blankets, not just for the cold, but because I no longer recognized the air that moved through the house. What struck me the most wasn't the noise, or the mess, or even the lack of privacy. It was the absence of acknowledgement. I had become something they maneuvered around like a piece of furniture. Not deliberately cruel, just dismissively unaware. They didn't shout at me, they didn't insult me, but they didn't see me. The mail began to arrive addressed to them. Julie started taking calls on the front porch, pacing with a sense of ownership. Mark once referred to it as our house in a conversation with a neighbor, and I felt my spine go rigid like an instinct. I wanted to correct him, but I didn't. I spent more time in my room, which they began to treat as a space to knock only when necessary. I made myself small in the corners of the house, avoiding their arguments, their noise, their world. I timed my movements to avoid interrupting. It's strange how quickly you learn to disappear when no one is asking you to be present. I tried, of course, to contribute. I baked pies. I folded laundry. I kept the pantry stocked. But Julie had a way of thanking me with a tone that meant, "That's enough now." The twins barely said hello unless prompted. Mark was often too tired, too distracted, too busy. I remember one evening in particular. I had made soup from scratch, chicken and rice, the kind Mark used to love when he was sick. I set it on the stove and waited, listening for the front door. When they came in, I heard Julie laugh. "Smells like a hospital in here," she said. They ordered takeout 10 minutes later. No one touched the pot. I ladled a bowl for myself and ate in silence. That night, I stood in the hallway and looked at the family photos still on the wall. My wedding portrait, Mark's high school graduation, a Christmas picture from when the twins were toddlers, all red bows and matching pajamas. The images were like shadows of a different house, one that had warmth and noise, and me at the center of it. I stood there a long time, wrapped in my cardigan, letting the hum of the refrigerator fill the silence. The cold wasn't just in my bones anymore. It was in the walls. It was in the space between my voice and their ears. It was in the way I had to remind myself each morning that I still lived there. And in that silence, I began to wonder, if a ghost doesn't haunt, but is simply forgotten, does she still linger? Or does she quietly leave? It was the day of Ethan's birthday, my youngest grandson. He was turning 10. I had remembered that age as a threshold, a moment when children start pulling away from the simple pleasures and lean toward the more complicated ones. I had spent 3 days planning the cake, a chocolate sheet cake with raspberry jam in the middle and dark chocolate glaze on top. I'd made it every year since he was 4, even though last year no one touched it after Julie brought in a store-bought one with bright blue frosting and plastic decorations. I still made mine, quietly, out of habit, out of hope. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully climbed above the trees, and the house was still quiet. I laid out my clothes on the bed, a soft cream-colored dress with delicate lace along the sleeves. I had sewn it myself years ago for a wedding I never attended because I ended up working a double shift. It had always felt like a missed occasion stitched into fabric. I'd kept it clean, pressed, tucked away behind winter coats and old uniforms in the back of the closet. It fit me well enough, a little looser than I remembered, and the lining had yellowed faintly at the hem. But it looked respectable, presentable, a dress for a grandmother to wear on a grandchild's birthday. I fastened a brooch at the collar, brushed my hair into a low bun, and added a dab of powder to soften the years. I didn't want to stand out. I only wanted to belong in the picture. I walked down the stairs with the dress swaying slightly around my legs. In the kitchen, I checked the cake one last time, adjusting the candles so they stood evenly. The frosting had set just the way I liked, glossy, without cracking. I placed it on a serving plate and stepped into the dining room where the family had begun to gather. I heard the laughter before I saw the faces. Julie's voice cut through first, low and sharp, followed by a smothered giggle. I walked in and saw her whispering to her sister, who'd come for the party. Julie looked up, scanned me from head to toe, then leaned in again and muttered something I couldn't fully catch. But I caught enough. "Looks like she dressed for her own funeral." They both laughed this time. Even Mark, my son, let out a sound. Not quite a laugh, but not a protest either. He didn't look at me. No one did. I didn't say anything. I smiled faintly and walked to the corner of the room, setting the cake gently on the side table. The room spun slightly, not from dizziness, but from the sudden emptiness that bloomed in my chest. I could feel my cheeks burning, though I didn't cry. I never cried in front of people, not even when my husband passed. I saved tears for the laundry room or the car. Julie moved on to her guests. The children squealed over the gifts. Mark turned his attention to the grill, and I stood there in my hand-sewn dress, holding the serving knife no one would need. An hour later, after the noise had quieted and the paper plates had started to sag under half-eaten slices of store-bought cake, I slipped away to the laundry room. I took off the dress and folded it over my arm. In the corner, I filled a small basin with lukewarm water, added a touch of soap, and gently began to wash the fabric. There was no real stain, no sauce, no wine, no mud, but I scrubbed the hem anyway, as though the laughter had soaked into the threads and I could lift it out with enough water and soap. I watched the suds cloud around my hands and pretended they were erasing the words. I hung the dress by the back door, letting the late sunlight dry it in the breeze. It swayed gently, quiet and ghost-like, the lace catching light with each breath of wind. I stared at it for a long time. That night, I didn't join them for leftovers. I stayed upstairs, listening to the muffled thump of footsteps and the clinking of dishes. The cake I had made sat untouched on the kitchen counter. I could hear the sound of the refrigerator door opening and closing, but no one reached for it. I lay in bed thinking about how fabric holds memory. The warmth of a child held to your chest, the smell of soup rising from a pot, the press of a palm on your shoulder, and also the memory of humiliation, of being looked through, laughed at, dismissed as an ornament of the past. I didn't wash that dress again. I folded it and placed it in the bottom drawer, beneath the quilt I had started years ago but never finished. Some things you keep, not because you'll wear them again, but because you want to remember the moment you stopped. After the birthday party, I stopped trying to be seen, not all at once. There was no dramatic declaration, no slamming of doors or tearful withdrawal. It happened gradually, like lowering the volume on a song until only the rhythm hums faintly in the background. I began to treat my presence in the house like something optional, something that could be folded away neatly when inconvenient. It was easier for them, I noticed, and over time, easier for me too. I still woke early. Old habits from hospital shifts never die. I'd move through the kitchen before anyone else was up, making coffee quietly, cleaning counters that were already clean. I left the room before they entered it. I avoided the morning rush of backpacks and car keys and voices that always seemed to talk over each other. I stopped offering breakfast. They hadn't needed it in a long time. The afternoons were mine. I started taking long walks with no destination, just loops through the neighborhood, down residential streets and around the lake at the edge of town. I'd stop at the library sometimes, not to check out books, but to sit in the quiet. There was a calm in the way light poured through the tall windows and fell across empty tables. I liked the hum of the HVAC, the shuffle of distant pages turning, the occasional cough from someone tucked behind a screen. No one knew me there. That suited me. When I returned home, I moved like I was trespassing. I slipped up the stairs without a sound, careful to avoid the creaking step near the landing. I'd stay in my room until the noise downstairs dulled. Sometimes I heard laughter, sometimes arguing, sometimes just the television playing into no one's attention. I stopped watching television with them. I stopped asking about their days. I stopped being present in the places where decisions were made, about dinner, about chores, about vacations that I wasn't part of. No one noticed. That became my certainty. The absence of reaction was louder than any words. I became an observer, a shadow, a quiet, reliable fixture that didn't interfere. My laundry was always folded before anyone saw it. My dishes washed and dried. My groceries labeled and tucked away in the bottom shelf of the pantry. They started buying foods I didn't eat. They stopped asking what I needed. One evening, I overheard Julie talking on the phone, her voice drifting up from the living room like smoke under a closed door. She was discussing options about long-term care, retirement communities, places that could provide structure. She didn't mention my name, but I knew. The conversation was clipped, efficient, not unkind, just strategic. Later that week, Mark printed out a list of elder care facilities. I found it by accident on the printer tray. He hadn't given it to me, hadn't even brought it up. It was folded in half, but I saw the header. I stared at it for a while before placing it back where I found it. I didn't need to read the details. The idea was clear enough. I remember standing at the top of the stairs that evening, looking down into the front hallway as Julie placed a delivery on the console table, a package of vitamin supplements she'd ordered for herself, a new set of reusable grocery bags, a box labeled Minimalist Pantry Makeover. It struck me how many things were being redesigned, improved, restructured. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt, not in the way I might have been years ago. I just realized that I had become part of the clutter they were learning to manage, a detail in their domestic project. I returned to my room and opened the old wooden box I kept beneath my bed. It was filled with documents, insurance papers, banking records, deeds, everything still in my name. They hadn't asked, they had assumed. That night, I started a new notebook, a plain black spiral one I had picked up from the pharmacy. On the first page, I wrote a single sentence: "Decisions made in silence carry their own weight." Below that, I made a list: names, dates, accounts, possibilities. It didn't feel like a plan, not yet. It felt like a remembering, like gathering up the edges of something I'd let unravel too long. But the real shift came not from them, but from someone outside. A few days later, a knock came at the door mid-morning. I didn't answer. It wasn't for me. Through the upstairs window, I saw a woman with a clipboard and a badge, neatly dressed, smiling politely. She spoke with Julie for a long time on the porch, occasionally pointing toward the house. I found out later, through overheard snippets and half-whispered tension, that someone had contacted the local social services, a neighbor maybe, or the woman from the market who always asked if I needed help carrying my bag. Someone had said, "There's an elderly woman in that house. She always walks alone. Looks sad. Maybe someone should check on her." Julie was livid. Mark was embarrassed. And suddenly, I became a visible fixture again. Not for love, not for guilt, but for optics. Over the next few days, they overcompensated. Julie bought me a new robe. Mark started asking if I needed anything when he went out. There were fresh flowers on the kitchen table, a plate of fruit by my door. They checked in with exaggerated concern, as though performing affection for an unseen audience. I saw the shift for what it was: not care, not remorse. They were afraid of how they looked. It struck me then, not only was I a burden in their private lives, I could be molded into a benefit to their public image. "See how we care for her," they could say. "She's lucky to be with us." I had become another opportunity for them to prove something that didn't exist. And that was the moment I knew I had to go. Not eventually, not after another slow decline. Now, before they used me as proof of their kindness, before I became a photo on a brochure, before they put me in a frame and called it home. I sat by the window with the light off and watched as Mark carried trash to the curb. He didn't look up. He didn't glance toward my window. He had earbuds in. He was humming something I didn't recognize. I didn't wave. I didn't tap the glass. I just watched him disappear into the dark, and I thought, this is what it feels like to go in reverse. Not to retreat in shame, but to rewind gently until you find the moment you started fading, and then stop. I didn't pack a suitcase. I didn't make a list of what to take. The truth was, I didn't need much. The things I valued most had long since been stored away or forgotten, and the rest, the furniture, the dishes, the old embroidered pillows on the sofa, had become theirs in practice, if not in title. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It hadn't for a long time. I began by sorting the papers, slowly, methodically, a few folders each night when no one was paying attention. I took them upstairs to my room: bank statements, property deeds, retirement documents, insurance files, and arranged them on my bed like pieces of a puzzle only I knew how to solve. Each page was a small act of memory, a quiet assertion that I still existed on paper, even if not in the room. I didn't rush. I didn't have to. That was the gift of being overlooked. Time expanded in the shadows. No one asked what I was doing. No one knocked on my door. I made a call from the library, using the phone in the small study cubicle at the back. It felt old-fashioned, but safe. I contacted a lawyer I had known years ago, back when her son was in the hospital, and I had sat by his bedside as his post-surgical nurse. She remembered me, not my face, but my voice. That was enough. We met once, discreetly. She brought a brown leather folder and a calm presence. She didn't ask why. She only asked what I wanted. I told her in simple terms. I wanted to secure my choices. I wanted to ensure that what I had built, earned, and kept intact through years of quiet sacrifice would go to people who wouldn't laugh at me behind closed doors. She nodded and began the paperwork. I changed the executor. I reassigned beneficiaries. I updated the will and the trust and the contingency plans. Everything was rewritten in clear legal terms. Nothing dramatic, nothing scandalous, just corrected. Each time I signed a document, I felt something inside me release, like a knot that had been there for years, loosening one loop at a time. Back at the house, I was more present than ever, but in the way a closing chapter is present at the end of a book. They talked over me, around me, through me. Julie planned a weekend trip without mentioning it to me, even though I was clearly the one expected to feed the dog and water the plants while they were gone. Mark gave me a curt nod when I handed him the mail. One of the twins asked if I still had a job. I smiled, said no, and walked away before the follow-up question. Then one afternoon, Julie made a joke about old people and their cluttered wills. She laughed, not knowing how right she was. I nodded politely and folded the towel in my hands. The next morning, I woke early and took one last walk through the house before anyone stirred. I moved through the rooms slowly, silently, touching only with my eyes. The hall closet still smelled faintly of cedar. The tile in the bathroom was cold under my feet. The kitchen was clean, too clean, sterile in the way a place becomes when warmth has long been drained from it. In my bedroom, I left everything in place. The dresser, the quilt, the half-finished book on the nightstand. I placed the last envelope, the legal summary, neatly printed and signed, inside the drawer where they kept my medication. They'd find it eventually. Then I stepped outside. No one heard me go. No door creaked. No alarm chimed. I didn't take the car. I didn't leave a note. I walked 3 blocks to the bus station. The clerk didn't ask questions. I paid cash. The seat I chose was at the very back, next to the window. I rested my bag on my lap and stared out at the blur of houses and trees as the bus pulled away from the curb. It was not an escape. It was an ending done properly. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel fear. What I felt was quiet. A deep, clean quiet I hadn't known in years. Like finally hearing your own breath after being underwater too long. As we passed the outskirts of town, I saw a row of mailboxes perched on tilted posts. One of them had a faded sticker on the side. It read, "Live simply, love deeply." I thought of my house, the one they called theirs now, and I thought, let them keep it. Let them inherit the silence I left behind. The kitchen table had always been the quiet center of my life. It was where I'd graded nursing exams when I taught part-time at the community college, where I'd arranged pills into tidy plastic trays during my husband's final months, where I once taught Mark how to write his name with oversized pencils and lined paper. There were small nicks on the surface from years of use, each one a tiny imprint of memory. That table had held conversations, tears, late-night cocoa, and morning crossword puzzles. But now it held something else. It held the truth. But before I placed the first folder down, I had gone back. just once. Not to the house, not to the lawyer's office, to the hospital. It was no longer the same hospital I had worked in all those years ago. The wing where I had spent most of my life had been renovated. The walls were brighter, the signage modern, the cafeteria menu fancier. But the bones of the place were still familiar, the way the elevators chimed, the smell of antiseptic mixed with coffee, the coolness of the tiled hallway floors beneath your shoes. I wandered slowly, unnoticed. Just another older woman in a cardigan, walking with purpose but no urgency. I found myself outside the old OR wing. The hallway was empty. On the left was the window that looked into the observation gallery of Operating Room 4. I stood there, my hand resting on the cool metal railing, and watched the empty room below. Years ago, I had saved a boy in that room. I remembered everything about it. His name, the color of his hair, the shape of the laceration, the rhythm of the crash cart monitor. He had been barely 8 years old, brought in after a fall through a glass table. Blood loss was severe. The surgeon was young, nervous. I was not. I took over the line. I steadied the bleeding. I issued instructions calmly but firmly. I pressed my hand to the boy's chest, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was slipping. I brought him back. Later, when he stabilized, his mother called me an angel. The boy said, with a smile so faint it almost wasn't there, "You saved me." I hadn't thought about that moment in years, but standing there now, alone above that silent room, I remembered what it meant to be necessary, to be seen, to be relied upon, not out of habit or convenience, but because something in me mattered. It was the opposite of what I had become in my own home: invisible, optional, dispensable. They didn't need me, not the real me. They needed a placeholder, a convenience, someone to fold towels, buy milk, be silent, not someone who held the line between life and loss. That was when the decision, the final one, became whole in my chest. I walked out of the hospital lighter than when I walked in. And when I got home, I didn't hesitate. I spread out the documents slowly, carefully, beneath the thick lace tablecloth that hadn't been removed in years. Not because I was hiding them from someone, but because I was placing them somewhere safe, somewhere that felt like mine, even in the middle of everything that no longer did. There were folders marked with color-coded tabs, one for banking, one for property, one for the trust. Everything was signed, notarized, and copied in triplicate. My name sat at the top of each page, crisp and deliberate, my signature looped with care at the bottom of each declaration. These papers were not dramatic. They were precise. They had weight, not emotional, but legal, a different kind of authority. I had made decisions not in anger, but in clarity. The house would go to a foundation for transitional housing, something I'd read about years ago and admired from afar. The savings would be transferred to a scholarship fund for low-income nursing students, preferably older women returning to school, like I once was. The small parcel of land I'd inherited from my grandmother in South Carolina would be handed to a local gardening collective that fed their community year-round. I made arrangements for everything except farewells. That was intentional. I didn't want to leave words that could be spun, quoted, mourned, or misunderstood. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of decoding my motives. I didn't want them to look for hidden apologies or veiled messages. What I did in full view. They just hadn't been paying attention. Inside the last folder was a short letter, not a goodbye, but a summary. It listed my wishes in simple, legal language. I addressed it to no one in particular, but it would be obvious who it was meant for when they found it. I placed that folder inside a thick manila envelope and slid it into the space between the tablecloth and the table. The weight of it disappeared beneath the fabric like a quiet stone dropped into still water. Later, I cleaned the kitchen, not just out of habit, but as ritual. I wiped the counters. I emptied the refrigerator of anything that could spoil. I placed the set of keys on the windowsill above the sink, the same spot I used to leave notes for Mark when he was a teenager staying out too late. I folded the dish rag 3 times and laid it over the faucet. I moved through the rest of the house in the same way, folding, dusting, clearing, pausing in each room long enough to see it not as mine, but as a space I had borrowed. I left my bedroom untouched. Let them find it as I'd left it. Bed made, curtains open, slippers neatly aligned by the dresser. The final act came that night. I sat at the table again, with the lace cloth covering the only remaining truth in the house. I brewed tea and drank it slowly. The clock ticked on the wall above the pantry door, the same clock that had hung there since 1989. It clicked with a kind of old, stubborn rhythm. I wrote nothing in my notebook that night. I didn't need to. The writing was done. The decisions had taken shape in ink and witnessed signatures. I didn't need to remind myself of anything anymore. As I poured the last of the tea into the sink, I felt no weight in my chest, no sorrow in my limbs, only a kind of relief, like I had finally stepped outside a play I no longer belonged in, like I had turned off a light in a room no one remembered entering. The next morning, the table sat there, just as always, the cloth unwrinkled, the house still, and under that cloth, sealed and silent, waited the moment they would realize I had been present all along, just not in the way they imagined. The house glowed that evening, the way it always did in December. Warm light pooled through the windows. String lights blinked from the porch rails, and somewhere inside the scent of cinnamon and clove clung to the air like nostalgia. From the sidewalk, it looked like a portrait of holiday perfection. Laughter behind frosted glass, silhouettes moving through familiar rooms, the kind of domestic peace people paste on cards and send to distant relatives they never call. But I wasn't in the picture. I watched from across the street for a few minutes, mostly out of curiosity, partially because I wanted to feel something. Not regret, not anger, just confirmation that I had done the right thing, that I had removed myself in time. Through the window, I could see the tree, towering, plastic, but beautiful, decorated in gold and red, topped with the same crooked angel Mark made in 2nd grade. Julie was handing out drinks in her velvet dress, and the twins, now teenagers, lounged on the couch with phones in their hands, barely looking up. A few neighbors milled about, ones I used to wave to from the garden. The house was full of people, full of noise, full of celebration. It looked whole, it looked undisturbed, and yet I knew there was an empty chair in the dining room, the one they always pulled up from the hallway for holidays. It had a wobble in the back leg and a deep scratch across the seat that I had never sanded down. That was my chair. They used to set a cushion on it, a folded shawl, and call it Grandma's spot. I wondered if they'd done that this year. I didn't stay long. I walked past slowly, just another bundled figure in the evening chill, unnoticed. I hadn't returned to haunt or to test their memory. I was only passing by, like wind, like silence. Earlier that day, I had spent my own holiday quietly in a borrowed apartment above a florist's shop downtown. The woman who owned the building had offered it to me for the winter in exchange for some light bookkeeping and help with her aging mother who lived upstairs. It was small but clean, with lace curtains and a view of the train tracks. I baked a small apple tart and brewed spiced tea. I wrapped a gift for the florist's mother, a soft scarf I'd knit in the evenings. I called no one. No one called me. I had expected loneliness. I had even prepared for it. But what I found instead was an odd kind of peace. There was no forced laughter, no tired arguments over gift receipts, no hollow toasts to the good old days. There was just the quiet ceremony of my own choosing, a real tree from the corner lot, a single strand of lights, the scent of nutmeg on my sleeves. I didn't dress up. I didn't make a large dinner. I wore a soft sweater and sat by the window with a book I'd already read twice before. The cat that lived in the alley downstairs crept up the fire escape and meowed until I let her in. She curled up beside me without permission, the way all creatures do when they sense softness. Back in the house I had left behind, someone else was likely carving the roast I used to prepare. Someone else was slicing the cranberry sauce, arranging place cards, turning up the music. Maybe they noticed my absence. Maybe they mentioned me in passing. A quiet, "she's not coming this year," or perhaps, "she's traveling," as if my departure had been a whim and not a withdrawal. But I doubted they truly understood what they had lost. Not the physical things, not the inheritance, not even the comfort of my presence in the background. What they had lost was the thread of memory that stitched the house together, the keeper of the stories, the one who remembered birthdays without checking a phone, who made traditions out of flour and time, and hands that folded napkins the same way. Every year, they had replaced me with convenience, and now they were celebrating in a house that still looked like mine but no longer belonged to me. I took one final glance at the glowing windows before turning down the side street. The snow hadn't started yet, but the sky promised it would. My boots crunched softly on the gravel. The night pressed in gentle and still. As I walked back to my temporary home, I passed a small boy pulling a sled behind his father. He looked up and smiled. I smiled back. That was enough. There was no applause for leaving quietly, no medals for choosing dignity over drama. But there was stillness, there was space, and in that space, I found a truth I hadn't known I was searching for. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is remove herself completely and let the absence speak for itself. Before I left, I returned once more to the house, early, long before the party began. I stood in the doorway of what had once been my bedroom. I looked around at the carefully folded blankets, the small chair with the frayed cushion, the framed photo still sitting on the dresser. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the slip of paper I had written the night before. I placed it on the pillow. It said, "Don't look for me. I was already here. With love, your ghost of a mother." No dramatic reveal, no tearful goodbye. Just a final note from someone who had once held the house together with quiet hands and had finally set herself free. The first morning at my new address felt strange, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was quiet in a way that didn't feel like erasure. It was the kind of quiet that held permission, not absence. No footsteps overhead, no voices in the hallway, no muffled television behind a door that was never really open for me. Just the steady ticking of an old wall clock and the soft shuffle of my own slippers across clean tile. The apartment was above a small flower shop on a tree-lined street where the sidewalks cracked from old roots, and the street lamps gave off a soft, golden glow after dusk. I had come to it by chance or fate, or maybe just quiet persistence. The woman who owned the shop, Angela, had been a patient of mine once, years ago, after a complicated surgery. She didn't recognize me at first when I stepped into her shop looking for a small poinsettia just before the holiday. But when she did, something lit in her face. Recognition, yes, but also a kind of reverence I hadn't felt from anyone in a long time. She had a spare apartment upstairs, usually used for visiting vendors or short-term stays. When I asked if she'd consider renting it out more permanently, she said yes without hesitation. The rent was modest. The walls were freshly painted. The furniture was simple but warm, the kind that had been chosen with comfort, not trends in mind. The bed was soft. The windows opened easily. There was a stove with a temperamental pilot light and a refrigerator that hummed like a lullaby. I moved in with 2 suitcases and a box of kitchenware. I didn't bring anything unnecessary. No photo albums, no heirlooms, just the essentials: a kettle, 2 sweaters, a few paperbacks, and a cast iron pan that had survived more than one generation. The rest I left behind, not in bitterness, but in recognition that some things aren't meant to follow you. The days took on a rhythm of their own. In the mornings, I helped Angela with inventory or deliveries, sometimes ringing up customers when she needed to run errands. The shop smelled like soil and eucalyptus, and my hands were often dusted with pollen by noon. I liked the work. It wasn't demanding, but it was honest. It asked just enough of me to remind me that I still had something to give. In the afternoons, I walked through quiet neighborhoods, past old churches and empty schoolyards. I found a bench in a park near the library where I would sit with a book or just watch the trees move in the wind. Sometimes I wrote in a notebook I kept folded in my coat pocket, not stories, just fragments, observations, bits of thought I didn't want to lose to time. Once a week, I visited the public market and bought what I needed: fresh bread, root vegetables, coffee beans by the ounce. I cooked in small portions. I ate by the window. I listened to classical music on a battered little radio someone had left behind in the cabinet. The sounds filled the space without crowding it. No one here knew me as anyone's mother. No one here expected casseroles or rides to soccer practice. I wasn't background support or the keeper of a legacy. I was just Mary Louise, a woman who helped at the flower shop and always had a clean handkerchief in her coat pocket. There was power in that simplicity. Occasionally, a letter would arrive in the building's shared mailbox, misaddressed or bearing a name that wasn't mine anymore. I would sort it quietly and move on. My name hadn't been called aloud in so long that when someone said it, just once at the pharmacy, I startled like it was a forgotten song. I never told Angela everything. I didn't need to. She never pried. She offered warmth when I needed it, and distance when I didn't. There was grace in her presence, the kind that came not from knowing everything, but from allowing someone to keep parts of themselves unspoken. At night, I sometimes sat on the fire escape with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The alley below was lined with trash cans and the occasional stray cat, but the sky above was open. I could see the stars more clearly than I had from the suburbs. I didn't wish on them. I didn't ask for anything. I just looked. I had a key now that no one else possessed. A door that opened to a place where no one called it theirs before I did. A kitchen where no one moved my things. A life that wasn't filled with duties I hadn't agreed to. It was mine. Not loud, not grand, but real. And in that quiet truth, I found something I hadn't dared to expect again. Peace. It took them nearly 6 weeks to notice I was gone for good. At first, they must have assumed I was off visiting someone. An old friend, a relative, a church group trip, perhaps. I had done things like that before, slipping away for a few days without ceremony. But this was different. This time, I didn't call. I didn't return. I left no forwarding address, no emergency contact, not even a note tucked under the toaster. The messages began slowly. A voicemail from Mark, short, stiff. He sounded more confused than concerned. He said he hoped I was okay. He didn't say he missed me. Then came the texts. Julie's tone was sharper, even behind the screen. She asked if I was trying to make a point, said it wasn't funny, that the kids were worried. I doubted that. The twins had long ago stopped noticing whether I was at the dinner table. Still, I let the messages sit unread. It wasn't about punishment. I simply had nothing left to explain. I learned through the grapevine that they had called a few neighbors, asked if anyone had seen me. One said she saw me walking with a suitcase, but didn't know where I went. Another mentioned seeing someone else park in my usual spot and assumed I had visitors. No one suspected I was leaving permanently. That's the thing about fading. You can vanish right in front of people, and they'll call it something else. Eventually, I heard that Mark went to the police, not to file a missing person report. No, He knew better, but to inquire about options in case I had suffered an accident. He phrased it like a concerned son. I could imagine the way he furrowed his brow, lowered his voice, let the words trail off as though choked by worry. I had seen him perform that concern before, in front of doctors, teachers, job interviewers. He knew how to be convincing. When they started calling my lawyer, that was when things began to shift. She called me one morning while I was trimming basil by the window. Her voice was calm, clipped. She said they had reached out twice, once with urgency and the second time with something close to desperation. They wanted answers. They wanted access. They wanted documents. She asked if I wanted her to respond. I told her no. A week later, she called again. This time she read me excerpts from an email Julie had sent. It was full of concern on the surface, but underneath it simmered with frustration. She said they were confused about the sudden changes in the estate paperwork, that they had not been informed of certain transfers and felt entitled to clarity. There was even a line about preserving the family legacy, which made me laugh softly into my tea. Entitled to clarity. After years of dismissing my voice, they now demanded answers. I declined again. That's when Mark showed up at my lawyer's office, not with threats, not with anger, but with a quiet, passive sort of pressure. He asked questions, tried to piece together a timeline, wanted to know where I had gone, why I hadn't consulted him, whether I was being influenced. My lawyer, bless her, responded with the same careful detachment I had once used on hospital patients who believed they knew more than the staff. She gave him nothing. She reminded him that I was of sound mind and had acted independently, that all documents were signed, filed, and final. He left with a tight jaw and no answers. Julie took a different approach. She sent flowers, not to me, of course, to the office, accompanied by a handwritten card in careful cursive that said, "We just want to talk." The arrangement was elaborate: white roses, pale lilies, a little too expensive for casual sentiment. I imagined her in their kitchen, hunched over the counter, composing the note with a glass of wine in one hand, rehearsing how it would be interpreted. But I had disappeared too thoroughly for their usual tools. No confrontation, no guilt trips, no shouting matches to script and dissect later. Just silence, just absence. And silence is a language they never learned to speak. Angela, sweet, observant Angela, asked me once if I ever thought about reaching out. She didn't press. She just wondered aloud, her hands busy arranging violets. I told her that I wasn't angry, that it wasn't about revenge or bitterness, that sometimes the only thing left to do is walk away so completely they can't follow the trail. She didn't ask again. Some nights I imagined them at the dinner table, glancing toward the hallway where I used to pass with quiet steps and folded towels. Maybe they noticed the missing hum of the dishwasher at night, the absence of home-baked bread cooling on the windowsill. Maybe they missed the way I used to refill the soap dispenser or the toilet paper roll. Small things, background things, the kind of things you only notice when they stop happening. But that was not my concern anymore. I had been the silent architect of their comfort for too long. Now they were living in a house built on memory, and they didn't know where the foundation had gone. Then, one morning, I received a letter. Not from Mark, not from Julie. It was from Evan, the older of the two twins, the one who used to sit beside me while I peeled apples, watching with quiet focus as the skins curled like ribbons into the bowl. His handwriting had matured, but it still leaned slightly to the left, the way it had when he was a child. He didn't ask where I was. He didn't ask me to come home. He didn't mention the house, or the inheritance, or his parents. It was one page, written in careful lines. He said he had realized lately that he never thanked me for the little things, that he had started thinking about the stories I used to tell him, that sometimes, when the house was too quiet, he remembered the sound of my slippers on the stairs. He said he was sorry. Not for one thing, but for all the things. He said he hoped I was safe, that he understood if I never replied, and that he just wanted me to know someone was still listening, even now. I read the letter once, then again, then folded it and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. I didn't answer, but I didn't throw it away. The seed had been planted, not for reconciliation, not for return, but for something softer, a new silence that didn't sting. Not all ghosts are bitter. Some just stop knocking, and some, when remembered kindly, linger a moment longer before fading from the room. It started with a voicemail. I hadn't checked the phone in days. I used it mainly for emergencies, kept the ringer off, and let the battery drain until I remembered to charge it. But that afternoon, as the wind knocked gently against the windows and the scent of eucalyptus from the flower shop below curled up into the apartment, I felt something nudge me. Not obligation, not curiosity, just a quiet instinct. The voicemail was from Mark. His voice was tight, controlled, as if he were trying very hard to sound calm. He said he had spoken with the lawyer again. He had seen the revised paperwork. He didn't understand the decisions I'd made. He asked if I was okay. He said the kids had noticed my absence. He said Julie was having a hard time sleeping. He said the taxes on the house were higher than they thought. He said he didn't know how to explain everything to the rest of the family. But what stayed with me, what I played twice, maybe 3 times, was the final sentence. The one that slipped out just before he hung up, barely louder than a whisper. I think we really messed this up. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even an apology. But it was the first honest thing I'd heard from him in years. That was when I knew it had started to sink in. Not all at once, not like lightning, more like water seeping through floorboards, slowly warping the foundation. A soft, silent recognition that something essential had been removed, and nothing they were used to could replace it. Angela told me a week later that someone had stopped by the shop asking for me. A young man, polite but fidgety, said he was a former student of mine, but she saw the photo in his wallet. It was Ethan, my grandson, older now, taller, his hair longer. She said he hadn't left a note, hadn't asked for contact details. He just looked around for a moment, then left quietly. I didn't cry. I sat with the knowledge the way one sits with an old quilt, something comforting, even if worn at the edges. They were beginning to feel it. The empty chair at Sunday lunch, the forgotten birthday reminder that used to come from my lips, not a phone, the missing notes in the pantry, the calendar without circled dates, the holiday pies that didn't taste quite right no matter how closely Julie followed the recipe, the quiet that lingered too long after a joke, the air that never quite warmed up, even when the heat was on. I imagined them checking the mailbox for letters that never arrived, wondering whether the silence meant punishment or absence or something worse. I knew that feeling. I had lived it every day in that house, long before I ever left it. One morning, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph, a copy of an old black and white image I hadn't seen in decades. It was Mark at 6 years old sitting on my lap on the back porch. I had a braid falling over my shoulder. He was holding a wooden airplane we had painted together. We were both laughing, no note, just the image. I turned it over, nothing on the back, no handwriting, no explanation, just silence. I left it on the mantel beside a dried lavender bundle. I didn't frame it. I didn't hide it. Some evenings I found myself thinking of Julie, not with hatred, not even with sadness, just clarity. I wondered if she had begun replaying conversations in her head. The little jabs, the snide remarks. I wondered if she regretted any of it, or if she was only upset that there had been consequences, because that was what they were all facing now. Not revenge, not malice, but consequence. I had not taken anything from them they hadn't already surrendered in the way they treated me. They wanted my presence without the inconvenience of my needs. They wanted my silence, but not the kind that echoed. Now they had it, and little by little, it was pressing in. The thing about absence is it accumulates. It's not a single moment, it's layers. A missing voice in the hallway, a recipe no one wrote down, a quiet that makes you flinch, an empty seat no one knows whether to fill or leave untouched. They were beginning to feel that weight, and I, for once, didn't have to carry it. The envelope arrived with a red stamp across the back. Final notice. Not a bill, not a threat, just a legal formality. It had been sent by my attorney just as we'd planned. It would have landed in their mailbox on a Tuesday, mid-morning, the kind of day when the kids were at school, when Mark was likely in the middle of a conference call, and Julie was probably preparing for another one of her community fundraisers. I imagined her flipping through the mail quickly, stopping only when she saw my name printed across the label in formal, unfeeling type. She wouldn't have opened it right away. She would have waited for Mark, let him take the lead. That's how it always was. But eventually, they would have opened it. They would have read the short, efficient letter confirming that the estate had been settled, that the house, though once registered in my name, had already been transferred to a local nonprofit for housing women in transition, that the remaining financial assets had been liquidated into 2 educational endowments, that the vehicles, the small stock portfolio, and the life insurance, all of it, had been allocated with finality. There were no loopholes, no space for negotiation, no grandchildren's clauses, no explanations. It was all already done. I had spent my life giving without transaction. I cooked, cleaned, nursed, provided, forgave. I gave more than I should have, more than anyone ever truly saw. For years, I believed that family meant doing that without pause. That sacrifice was the currency of love. But sacrifice, when unnoticed, when expected, when exploited, becomes something else. It becomes invisible. And so I left. Not just the house, not just the name on the mailbox. I left the version of myself they had grown comfortable ignoring. I left the table they never set for me. I left the role they had quietly rewritten into something muted and convenient. They received a second letter later that week. This one was not legal. It was handwritten. Just a single page. No greeting, no signature. It said, "When you laugh at someone long enough, they stop standing close enough to hear it. When you turn someone into a ghost, you can't expect them to leave you the keys." That was all. No apology requested, no invitation extended. I pictured Mark sitting at the kitchen table, my old kitchen table, rereading the letter with a clenched jaw, trying to piece together the timeline, trying to remember the moment it all slipped from his hands, wondering how long I had been planning it, wondering if there had been signs. There had been. They were just buried under the noise of their own comfort. And as for Julie, I imagined her calling her sister or a friend, spinning the story with just enough distortion to protect her pride, saying I had lost my mind, or been manipulated, or done something drastic. She wouldn't use the word betrayal. That would mean admitting they had done something to deserve it. But deep down, in the part of herself she reserved for truth, she would know. There was no inheritance, no nest egg, no surprise while waiting in a drawer, no final hour reversal. They were left with the shell of a house that no longer belonged to them, the routines they had shaped around my silence, the absence of something they never truly respected until it was gone. Evan found the dress. It had been tucked carefully into the back of my old wardrobe, still folded the way I'd left it, cream-colored, hand-sewn. the delicate embroidery on the collar slightly frayed, the threads soft from age and laundering. He pulled it out slowly, unsure of why it drew him, and held it in his lap as he sat down on the edge of the bed. He didn't call anyone, didn't say a word, just sat there, hunched over slightly, his hands curled around the fabric like it was something living, something breathing, something that had once held weight in the center of a life. And then the tears came. Not loud, not shaking, just slow. He let them fall onto the fabric, no attempt to wipe them away, no rush to hide. Because for the first time, he understood something that hadn't needed to be said. That dress had been worn by someone who fed him soup when he was sick, who braided his hair into silly knots when he was small, who stood behind everyone else in photos because she never needed the center. Someone who had once been the quiet gravity of that house. He folded the dress again, neatly with both hands, and returned it to the wardrobe, placing it with reverence, as though acknowledging that some kinds of presents never fully leave, even when they are no longer seen. I didn't watch them from afar. I didn't check up on them or ask around. That wasn't the point. My life was not a test for them to pass. My departure was not a lesson, but a boundary, a long overdue one. In my small apartment, I planted herbs in ceramic pots. I volunteered once a week at the local clinic just to keep my hands moving. I had a shelf of library books, a tea kettle that whistled when it was ready, and a cat who wandered in from time to time and decided I was home enough. On the wall above my writing desk was a framed piece of embroidery I had finished in the weeks after I left. It wasn't anything grand, just a simple phrase stitched in dark blue thread. I kept the part of myself you tried to bury. Some days I missed the idea of them, the shadow of what family should have been. But the grief was clean now, no longer tangled in the knots of unmet expectations, no longer softened by false hope. They were left with nothing, and I, finally, was full.